Stem-changing verbs in Spanish are verbs that change their beginning prefix, or stem, to generate a better sound when the words are said. In Spanish, there are 4 types of stem-changing verbs, and in the video, I will not explain all stem-changing verbs that exist in Spanish, but rather present a useful verb in each category so that you can understand how stem-changing works in Spanish and then apply it to any other verb that you want in that category. The 4 main types of stem-changing verbs in Spanish are to ie to I, o to ue, and u to ue. Considering to ie as the first category of stem-changing verbs in Spanish, I actually already covered a verb like that in one of my previous videos, and that is the verb tener. However, for the sake of learning, let's use a different useful verb like empezar, which means to start or to begin. At first, the stem-changing rule will only apply in the yo, tú, él, and ellos pronouns, and will not apply in the nosotros and vosotros pronouns. You would want to say something like yo empezo, but Spanish says that this word sounds bad when said, so instead, you have to slightly modify the stem of the verb from empezo to yo empiezo, which means I start. And the stem-changing concept applies to the rest of the pronouns aside from nosotros and vosotros. Tú empiezas, you start. Él empieza, he starts. Nosotros empezamos, we start. Vosotros empezáis, y'all start. And ellos empiezan, they start. As always, try not focusing on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation, and like I said at the beginning of the video, it's important to know how stem-changing verbs work in Spanish, but it's not important to know every single stem-changing verb like empezar, which changes from to ie. If you see a modified verb that goes from to ie, chances are that it's stem-changing. Next up, there are verbs that change their stem from to I, like decir, which is a useful verb meaning to say. Decir is actually considered to be irregular in the yo pronoun, with the construction yo digo, but as far as the rest of the pronouns go, decir still applies its stem-changing rule for tú, él, and ellos. You would want to say tú dices, but Spanish says that this verb sounds bad when said, so instead, you have to say tú dices, which means you say. Él dice, he says. Nosotros decimos, we say. Vosotros decís, y'all say, and ellos dicen, they say. Try not focusing on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation, but in case you see any other verb that changes from to I, chances are it's stem-changing. Next up, there are verbs that change from o to ue, and I actually covered a useful verb like that in one of my previous videos, which is poder, but for the sake of learning, let's use a different useful verb like recordar, which means to remember. Instead of saying yo recuerdo, you need to say yo recuerdo, which sounds better when said, and the same concept applies to the rest of the pronouns. Tú recuerdas, you remember. Él recuerda, he remembers. Nosotros recordamos, we remember. Vosotros recordáis, y'all remember. And ellos recuerdan, they remember. Try not focusing on these pronouns because they're not that useful in conversation, but if you see a verb with ue in it, chances are it's stem-changing. And finally, there's one last type of a stem-changing verb in Spanish, and as far as I know, it's the only verb in Spanish that changes from u to ue, and that is the verb jugar, which means to play. Instead of saying yo jugo, you need to say yo juego. And one thing to note about both of these words is that the word jugo, on its own, actually means juice, and so it makes sense why it needs to be modified so that it's not confused with this word. However, the word juego on its own can also mean game, as in videojuego, which means video game. But the word juego itself changes its meaning in context. And with the verb jugar, the stem-changing rule will only apply for the yo, tú, él, and ellos pronouns. Tú juegas, you play. Él juega, he plays. Nosotros jugamos, we play. Vosotros jugáis, y'all play. And ellos juegan, they play. Try not focusing on these pronouns because, like I say all the time, they're not useful in conversation. What you should have known from this video is how to systematically modify stem-changing verbs in Spanish so that you can understand how words sound better when they're said out loud. Of course, learning all stem-changing verbs in Spanish is completely redundant, but it's very useful to understand how every type of stem-changing verb works in Spanish. This has been Stem-Changing Verbs in Spanish. Thank you for watching this video, and hopefully I made your learning just a bit simpler.